Thanks to God for my Redeemer. Thanks for all thou dost provide. Thanks for time.
We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. So if you'll be turning over there, that's where we're going to be studying this evening. And you recall, I hope, that chapter 8 was about what? Giving. Well, guess what? He's going to continue talking about giving. Woo! Chapter 9 is really an extension of that particular teaching. And as the Apostle Paul is trying to encourage these, because this is basically an encouragement about giving, right? Do we need to be encouraged to give? Usually. Usually we do. And, that's an important thing to think about as we're going through this particular passage, because, this is, as a preacher, I get it. There are so many preachers that are out there with various denominations. They're all about, give us your $1,000 pledge and the Lord's going to heal your whatever, So much so that a friend of mine from New England, who is not yet a Christian, I keep praying for him, trying to work on him. But anyway, we were talking one time, and he basically said that religion is just like any other business. It's all about making money. That's really all it is. Which I thought, man, that is a cynical point of view. But on the other hand, I understand why, because there's a lot of folks that's just all it's all about. Well, I guess part of the reason I'm bringing all that up is just to say that giving really is a Christian thing to do, but people don't need necessarily to be hammered over the head about it. In fact, that's part of the reason why it is that I'm offering this semi-apology for having to study it. I really shouldn't have to, but we sometimes do get the wrong impression about things. But this particular passage is the Apostle Paul encouraging them, and I hope maybe reframing it for us. Because you might recall in chapter 8, remember how Paul kind of frames it? He says, starting in chapter 8 and verse 1, just kind of looking there with me for just a moment. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. I don't know how about you, but that kind of helps to reframe things. Giving in this particular situation or with this kind of a mindset is not necessarily a duty and obligation. What is he calling it? A favor, an opportunity to give, something to participate in, something that you'd want to participate in. And I think that's an important kind of framework for us to take a look at this in. Yes, sir.
As Paul's approaching this, you can see that even Paul was surprised by their amount.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is these people were very hard up. This whole area had been hit so hard by military activity and others that the Roman government actually had suspended taxation in that area for a while because they just didn't have it to give.
Right.
But when you give yourself first, then it becomes a little easier.
Sure, absolutely.
You notice that he says, I want to make you aware of the grace that God has given these people.
Yeah.
And giving is one of God's gifts. It's a grace.
It is.
Not everybody can easily do it.
That's true.
I've told this story several times, but it has had a tremendous impact, I think, upon my attitude toward giving. I can remember a Sunday morning. I don't know why the kids weren't going. We had to walk 2 miles to church. We didn't. It was during the war and couldn't get gas, and so our old car, my dad had driven down to the back 40 and just let it sit. And but anyway, my mom was going. She was going to walk. I think it's because the weather was probably pretty bad that day, and so we weren't going. The kids weren't. But I remember her holding up a quarter. Literally, it was the last quarter or penny or nickel in the house. But that's what she was going to drop in the plate that morning. And I remember sometime during the coming week, we got a letter from my uncle who was in the Navy. And when she opened the letter, it had $100 bill in it.
Which back in those days was a small fortune.
Which was a lot of money in those days when you worked for like 25 cents an hour in the fields.
Yeah.
But to me, now, she may have had some communications with our Uncle Joe, I don't know. But to me, that was always rather dramatic that you give and God's going to notice, and you can never outgive God.
Right, right. And of course, this is not to say necessarily that the more you give, the more that God is going to enrich your bank account.
Yeah.
But it does mean that there still are blessings.
Yeah.
And very much like what you're saying, you really can't outgive God. It's not always necessarily in dollars and cents, but there's a lot of other blessings as well that
like
come from that.
Account, give and it'll be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that sort of thing in mind, because and the reason I think I'm just kind of going over this is because it really does matter how you frame things, right? You can frame things with greed, and you're not going to give very much. You can frame things as an obligation, you're still not going to give very much. You can frame things as a favor, as a grace, it's a whole different thing. So with all that in mind, then, let's continue reading in this theme in chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Paul says, "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I have sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift." By the way, if I were translating this, I think I'd put quotation marks around bountiful gift, because I think he's kind of quoting here something that they had offered. "So that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed, as it is written, He scattered abroad, He gave to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now, He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. you will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also by prayer on your behalf yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. So, what does the word superfluous mean? He said it's superfluous for me to say this.
Needless, not necessary, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, it's kind of along that line. I have a funny story. It's not necessarily super related, but used to be that when my son was like in junior high school, his youth minister wanted the kids in the youth group to describe themselves in one word. And so they got to my son, and he said, superfluous. He thought it meant, I feel really good. So the youth minister came to us later on and said, your son feels like, like he's an extra, like he's not needed. What? Yeah, he said superfluous, so we had to talk with him. But anyway. It is superfluous, he says. It's really not needed. It's not really overkill, but you already know this. It's kind of what he seems to be saying. For me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. So really, what is he kind of saying here? Why would it be superfluous for Paul to write to the Corinthians about this ministry?
Well, because he feels that he's already said, you were the first to make the suggestion and start, and I've been using you as an example to others.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Yeah, really. He does mention there in verse 2, right? I know your readiness. How did he know about their readiness?
They had apparently the year before talked about it.
Yeah, apparently a year ago when he had been there, and he talked to them about this ministry, they were the first to say, well, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. We'll be sure and do that. But now it's been a year, maybe a little bit more, and Paul is starting to wonder. By saying to them, how does he counsel them to give? Every first day of the week, he says. Why? So that a big contribution won't be necessary when I come. Because, you know us as human beings, we have the tendency to kind of like, I forgot my wallet this week. Or I forgot my checkbook this week. I'll just make it up next week. And next week comes and, I said I was going to make it up next week. And we just, if we might have pledged $1,000 or something like that, if we are going to be like giving it all at one heap, why we might not have enough money in our bank account, so we may end up giving 500 or something instead. And that's kind of what Paul was a little bit afraid of, and so he was saying, look, here's the way you want to do it. You want to go ahead and give every week, if it's $10 a week or whatever, or they didn't have dollars, but you know what I'm trying to say. Give $10 every week. If you do it every week, guess what happens after a year's time? Well, you got a lot of money. So that's sort of the idea behind it. So Paul has already been perhaps a little bit worried about it, and he's trying to give them some pointers on how to do it all the way back in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. But now that he has written some difficult letters, perhaps is a little bit afraid that maybe he might have stepped on too many toes, especially among those who might have been well-heeled, have some money to be able to give, that perhaps they might not be as prone to give as well as they would have otherwise. So Paul is here trying to prompt them, trying to urge them, trying to nudge them along to get them to give. He says, I know your readiness about which I boasted to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred most of them up. When Paul uses this word readiness and boast about the Corinthians, what has he said about the Corinthians and all the churches in Achaia, to the Macedonians? What apparently has he said?
He's bragging on them, essentially.
Yeah, the Corinthians, they volunteered to do this, well over a year ago. And they're ready to do this. And they promised a bountiful gift. And he's really kind of patted them on the back and built them up in the eyes of the folks in Macedonia. That's what's caused them, the Macedonians, at least in part, to give as generously as they did, because they had heard that the Corinthians and the churches in Achaia had given so generously. So in any case, Paul is again, he's trying to really kind of nudge them and tell them, look, this is what's happened, and your zeal has apparently really kind of prompted the Macedonians to give zealously as well. They have been, look at the latter part of verse 2 there, your zeal has stirred up most of them. A little bit of competition going on there. Interestingly enough, what is Paul now telling the Corinthians about the Macedonians?
They've gave
Yeah, you see what's going on here? Paul has boasted about the Corinthians to the Macedonians. And now, in the Corinthian letter, he's boasting about the Macedonians to the Corinthians. What's he doing here? Maybe generating a little bit of competition? Yes, sir.
Oh, I was just thinking in the latter part of verse 2, another verse, I like the wording here, but it's like Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Provoke one another to love and good works.
Yeah.
Your zeal has provoked very many.
Yeah.
The whole reasoning behind.
Yeah.
Gathering
Provoking one another to love and good deeds, we need to find ways of doing that. Paul had apparently found a way of doing that by maybe generating a little bit of competition between them. Look at what the Macedonians are doing. Look what those Corinthians are doing. And trying to hold them up as an example. And the effect had been that, the Macedonians have been stirred up in their zeal. And now Paul is trying to put the shoe on the other foot, as it were, and try to stir up the Corinthians by means of what the Macedonians had done.
Was he collecting, was this above and beyond their means? Because it was for the poor and the needy in Jerusalem and Judea, right?
Yes. This project essentially was a special project. And it would appear that this was a project that might have been suggested to Paul during one of the times whenever he was in Jerusalem talking to the other apostles. And one of the things apparently that the other apostles had said to him was something along the lines of, be sure to remember the poor, which Paul says I was more than happy to do. And apparently this kind of, Paul says, they said, remember the poor. Now, whether Paul supplied the poor in Judea, or supplied those words, or whether the apostles had actually said that, and Paul just left it out in what he said. Nevertheless, the point at least is that appears to be when the project started, at least in Paul's mind. And so it is that whenever he has gone to, for example, Galatia, as well as Macedonia and Achaia and all these other places where he established churches already, he was sharing this idea, this project that he had, and so forth. And that's specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that appears to be specifically what Paul is trying to encourage them to do. But we also end up taking it for an example for how it is perhaps that we ought to give with regard to support of Bible classes or preachers or air conditioning or whatever it is that we end up having to spend money on. So, that answer the question? Okay, cool.
Well, they knew, I believe it was Agabus that prophesied that there was going to be a famine coming.
Yes,
so
it's true.
So they knew it was coming, and because of their faith in the prophet, and so they were trying to cut it off in the.
Yeah. And of course, as we've kind of talked about before, the Apostle Paul had a couple of motivations. Number one was, of course, to try to feed the poor. But also as well, you remember what the other motivation was?
Trying to bring the Jew and the Gentile together.
Yeah. He was trying to, he was really hitting hard on these Gentile churches to give this contribution so that he could take this contribution to Jerusalem, and the church in Jerusalem could distribute it among the poor. And while they're doing it, they might ask the question, where in the world did you get all this money? And the answer would be, your Gentile brethren have done this. Well, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. There was enormous amounts of animosity frequently between the Jew and the Gentile. And this was one of the big problems in the early church, is the Jew and the Gentile problem. We're supposed to all be in the same church. We're supposed to be, united. I'm supposed to consider you to be my brother. Come on. You guys eat bacon. Well, that's nothing. You guys end up only having one God. Or, whatever else that they might end up saying that was just a little bit odd as far as they were concerned. So there's some real animosity between Jew and Gentile quite often. But it's difficult to say you're a real jerk while someone's handing you a gift. So with all that in mind, this was part of the strategy that Apostle Paul had. We end up seeing so often in a lot of his writings. Ephesians chapter 2 is just one of the best examples of it, where the Apostle Paul is trying to talk about how it is the Jew and the Gentile church need to come together. They are one man, he says. God has put them all in one church, one family, one household, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, this was a part of what the Apostle Paul was attempting to do. Well, what is Paul apparently afraid of or worried about in verse 3? Yeah, he was afraid they were going to embarrass themselves after a fashion, which is kind of what I was on. If you take a look at the headline of the slide here, don't embarrass yourself with mediocrity. This was something he was apparently afraid of, that you're giving, instead of being a bountiful gift, was going to be a meh kind of a gift. So maybe the Macedonians might even outgive them. Boy, wouldn't that be embarrassing. So what had Paul done in order to avoid this embarrassment?
Send an emissary ahead of time.
Yeah.
They're on their way, but just be sure you're ready when they get here.
That's right. He was sending Titus and some other folks in order to be able to kind of nudge them along and say, okay, look, if this thing isn't organized quite yet, well, let's get it organized. Let's get this thing done. We want to not be embarrassed because, and we've talked about this before as well, it really is important to keep in mind that in the ancient world it was a huge deal between honor and shame. We kind of missed that an awful lot in America, in part because, we were America was pretty much kind of established on everyone's kind of equal and all that kind of stuff. Plus, some of the early colonists, they were rough and ready frontiersmen and so forth, and so embarrassment was not really one of the big things on their list of things. But honor and shame was a huge deal in most of the world, especially the Mediterranean world, and it continues to have tremendous effect, especially the further east you go. You get to places like China or Japan. Why? If you've lost face, boy, it's time to commit hara-kiri.
Suicides, or at least then, were very common because he had no place to go.
Yeah. Shame was just overwhelming, and so committing suicide was the only way out, I guess they thought to themselves. So this is a part of also of how Paul is trying to motivate them. Don't be embarrassed with a mediocre gift. sending some people to try to help organize this and make sure that everything is okay, so that they might be prepared, he says. I've sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. What is he talking about? I'm not looking for rocket science here. What is he talking about?
We've been waiting on you guys. Here it is.
Exactly. Well, what would happen then if the Macedonian representatives that arrived with Paul and found the Corinthians unprepared?
I think Paul wasn't telling the truth.
Yeah. Paul would have egg on his face, as they say, and the Corinthians would be embarrassed. It would be a kind of a double whammy. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. You lied to us, Paul. They weren't prepared. And was Paul lying to them about it? No, he wasn't lying to them. He was just
enthusiasm when he was there.
That's right. And he was only going on the enthusiasm that they had demonstrated. So why wouldn't he believe that they were going to have an abundant gift?
And we really don't have any indication as to whether or not this was necessary.
Yeah.
Because Paul delivered the gift to.
Yeah. What would the Macedonians think of the Corinthians if they ended up with a mediocre gift? What kind of Christians are these? Oh, my dog has escaped again. We're going to have to name him Houdini. I have no idea how he does that. Anyway, thank you.
It's interesting too. He says, if any of the Macedonians come with him.
Yeah. And apparently there were. Whenever we end up reading in the book of Acts who came with him, yeah, there were some Macedonians that did come. And why would they come along, by the way? Why would they come along?
Well, they want to be part of this project. I mean, they had given.
They were enthusiastic about the project. Yeah. Plus, it would appear, if you remember in chapter 8, Paul talked about how it was that he wanted to do not only what was right in the eyes of God, but also who else? In the eyes of men. Which is to say, in other words, you know what? It's great that you actually are on the up and up, but if what you're doing looks like it may not be on the up and up, that's still a problem. And so apparently Paul had encouraged the Macedonians, as well as the Ephesians, and as well as some of the folks from Galatia, and so on and so forth, to accompany them. So there was actually, there was a couple of cool things that happened whenever you did this. You had yourself, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe 10 or a dozen people that were accompanying Paul. First of all, they would end up seeing the money being delivered to the church in Jerusalem, exactly as Paul had said. But the other thing is that you're not as likely, when you're carrying that kind of money, and if someone finds out you're carrying that kind of money, what could happen? Especially on the high seas. I don't know how he fell over. Oh, look, he left behind the money. Well, finders keepers, losers weepers. So this was useful in a lot of different ways. In any case, the Macedonians would think perhaps that their brethren were perhaps maybe not as motivated as Paul said they were. Maybe they weren't quite as spiritual as they had assumed. Maybe they weren't as, I don't know, whatever. Maybe they were greedy. All these things said, the Macedonians would have not had as good an opinion of the Corinthians anymore. And what would the Macedonians think of Paul? I think Pam had mentioned the fact that maybe they'd think he was a liar, or had perhaps had exaggerated a bit. And what would the Corinthians feel like?
They'd be embarrassed, obviously.
Yeah, especially if the Macedonians said something.
Satan uses those kinds of things to drive wedges.
Yeah. Because, not that you necessarily want to be comparing all the time, but, Macedonians might be carrying a big old bag of money like this, but the Corinthians would be offering something about like this. That might not look too good. And so, because of the idea of shame, Paul is trying to kind of motivate them. Yes, sir.
What type of money would they have? Roman coins, Roman money?
Probably Roman money. There was a lot of things that were considered to be legal tender back in those days. Sometimes it was actually coins that had been made by the Roman government. In other cases, sometimes it was simply silver or simply gold, and you would, to know how much you were, something would be so much weight in silver or so much weight in gold. That's actually what a talent is, by the way. Whenever you read about a talent in Scripture, a talent was actually a measure of weight, so that you would have one of these balance kind of weight things, and over here you'd have a little stone that you knew was 1 talent in terms of its weight, and you would put your gold or something over on this until the balance went like that. So sometimes it would be that sort of thing. Sometimes it was in terms of jewelry. I didn't know this until fairly recently, I guess, but did you know that pearls were considered to be incredibly valuable? A single pearl, it was said, ended up being able to underwrite an entire Roman army at one point. A single pearl, which is just amazing. But, there would be a lot of things. Sometimes jewels, sometimes pearls, sometimes actual gold, sometimes coinage. So just a wide variety of different things. But anyway, that's the whole point of the pearl of great price. Anyway. What do you imagine Titus and the others would be doing as they arrived in Corinth during this previously promised, regarding this previously promised bountiful gift? What do you think that Titus would be doing?
They'd be encouraging. First of all, they'd inquire and then go do whatever action was, they're on their way.
So who's keeping the money?
Yeah.
And how much have we got? And is this what you guys had in mind? Is this what you had purposed? Is this what you had intended to do? Let's get this thing organized, because, a couple of weeks, Paul and his escort are going to be here. The Macedonians are going to be here. Let's get this thing rolling here. How would covetousness affect this bountiful gift? What is covetousness? Yeah.
Hang on what you got.
Yeah. So covetousness could affect this bountiful gift, because maybe they would want to keep the money for themselves. Yes, sir.
And not only does covetousness usually hold you back, but to justify yourself, you'll find yourself suggesting to others that they should not be.
Yeah.
I remember I cringed one time when my brother, is 2 years younger than I, moved to Winslow before I did, and to work on the railroad. And that's one of the better paying jobs in that part of the country, really. But a man gave him, in the church, gave him some advice that I didn't consider very good advice. His advice was that you need to take care of yourself first, set aside something for yourself first, and then the Lord and everybody else.
When you do that, you kind of have your priorities a little bit
I don't think
backwards.
my brother particularly took the advice because he was very generous as well. But anyway, I just thought that if that's your outlook on life, it's probably going to hold back a lot of the blessings that God would normally have given you.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And if you do not develop that sense of value system in the church, it will always hold you back. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
that you don't overcome this feed me first. But that is exactly, you go to all these business seminars and so forth, that is what you're going to hear and what they're going to preach, if you will. Pay you first, pay you first. That means regardless of the golden rule that we laugh about.
Yeah.
But before do it others, before they do it unto you.
Right, yeah.
Exactly what they teach in there. And if there's anything left, then you can get it. And I don't care what they talk about. It's like John chapter 8, verse 32.
Yeah. Yeah.
You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
Misuse of Scripture a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah. Yeah, it is important to certainly get the priorities straight. If we don't, then we're likely to miss the whole point. You know, we naturally don't want to rob other people. If I have gotten electricity from the power company, I can't in good conscience give away that money because it belongs to somebody else. I'm stealing it otherwise. But kind of to your point, we need to put the Lord first, always. And if I need to turn my air conditioner down, then that's what I need to do so that I can give what I need to give. But the point at least is that we certainly need to not let covetousness affect what it is that we're giving, but that we need to give generously. That's always important to do. Explain this farming metaphor about sowing. He says, now I say this, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. I don't think this is a hard metaphor to figure out, but since most of us are city folks,
If we plant one seed of corn, a stalk comes up. Now, the corn they have today is unlike the corn that they had when I was a kid, because we had to gather it by hand, and I remember a lot of stalks had sometimes 3 or 4 ears on one stalk. But you plant one grain of corn, and if you shelled all of the corn that you got off of that stalk, you might have 1,000 grains of corn.
right.
But if you planted 2 or 3 grains, then you'd get maybe 3,000 grains of corn. But if you planted thousands of grains, just think
Yeah,
how much you would get.
exactly. You?
My cattle, I had so much land, and I knew if I put out one bag of seed, there wouldn't be enough grass out there for those cattle to eat. And so I put out 3 bags instead of one. Now it's a lot easier to put out one because I had that hand crank that would, send the seed scattering.
Right.
And I had to, go up and down, and make sure I got it even. And if I just did that once, then that was a lot easier.
Oh, yeah.
But if I had 3 bags, I knew I better put those 3 bags out there if I wanted my cattle to have something to eat.
Yeah. Yeah.
That year.
Exactly. The more seed you scatter, there's a saying I heard one time. It's you can count the number of seeds in an apple, but can you count the number of apples in a seed? Okay, yeah, because there's actually going to be a lot of apples in that seed, right? And that's sort of the idea that you were talking about. The more seed you end up scattering, the more your return is going to be. One seed might end up producing 1,000 seeds, but if you planted 1,000 seeds, okay, well now you're talking about 1,000,000, so talking about 1,000,000 seeds. The whole point so what is Paul saying here exactly? What is Paul saying here? What's he trying to say?
Generosity produces generosity.
Yeah. Generosity will end up coming back and rewarding you. That's kind of what he's saying. Now he goes on to talk about, in verse 7, each one must do just as he purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. What does Paul seem to be promising them?
God's looking.
Yeah. And you know, there is and again, I don't want it to sound at all like I'm preaching or coming close to preaching the health and wealth gospel, where if you give X amount of money, God is going to return, 100 times more or something like that. But I will say this, just as an observation about Christians and so forth in my ministry generally, that God does seem to appreciate people that give generously. And I'm not just talking about necessarily giving in the plate as it's passed around, although that's certainly a way of giving. But there are Christians that I've known that, they give of a lot of other stuff too. They give of their time. If someone is sick, they're the ones that are bringing over meals to them or something. They're the ones that are going over and trying to provide other kinds of support, I guess. Sometimes financially, sometimes with things they can do. And here's my observation, that when God sees us doing something like that he says, oh, follow what I'm trying to say here, there's a good open pipe with which I can bless a lot of other people. If God is wanting to bless other people, do you suppose he's going to look for a pipe that's this big or one that's this big? Probably that big. And if I prove myself to be a pipe that's this big, what is it likely that God might just decide to do? Now, again, this is not a promise that he's going to make me wealthy, but what is the possibility of what God might do?
Give me a bigger pipe.
Yeah. Give me enough so that I might be able to continue to give that way, to help other people out that way. And it's the same sort of thing, I suppose. If you happen to be the boss in a business of some sort, and you've got a big project, and you've got, say, 10 employees, and they all range from a 1, the guy that's barely awake, to a 10 that gets everything done, who are you going to give the big project to? Your 10. That's who you're going to give it to. Why? Because he's the guy that gets it done, and he does it well. Same sort of thing, I think, can apply. Now, it is worthwhile noticing here that he does say, look down to verse 8? I haven't got my glasses on. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. So he appears to be talking not only perhaps about financial matters, but also perhaps things like righteousness, or is it really more blessed to give than to receive?
Well, Jesus said it, so.
It must be true. But what is your experience? The experience with me is it is more blessed to give than to receive. Yeah. So there is a blessing there if I'm giving with the right kind of heart. That and so many other different ways. There are ways in which we can get blessed beyond merely, financial reward. But the point that Paul is trying to get to here is that generosity is something that really is good, and God will reward it. Financially, maybe, but there's lots of other ways that He can also bless.
One of the psalmists says, I once was young and now I'm old, and I have never seen the righteous go hungry, or the children of the righteous begging for bread.
Yeah. It's true.
I think he's trying to make a point there.
Yeah. This is not to say that, you're going to be living in the lap of luxury. Your mom gave her last quarter. I gather that you didn't get rich thereafter, except for the $100 bill that you got. But my guess is that probably has kind of helped to keep body and soul together for the most part for the family. But it is to say that God will provide. And that's something that I think really is worthwhile and important for us to consider when we do end up giving, especially if we give financially, that God really does provide. What are some of the things that sometimes end up keeping us from giving generously? I'd like to suggest that perhaps the fear that if I give this away, I'm not going to have anything for me. I'm not going to have enough for me. And so we end up giving not quite as generously as we might otherwise. What is the good Christian attitude toward that sort of thing? What should it be? The Lord will provide. If we're afraid that I'm giving away my last 25 cents, I may not give. If on the other hand I have faith that God is going to take care of me, then okay, I can do that. I can do that because God is going to provide.
We're taught if we have two shirts and we see a brother that doesn't have one, then it doesn't tell us to give them both away, but it says give your extra to the brother that doesn't have one.
Exactly. So anyway, verse 7, we didn't spend much time on that one, but I think it really is important because once again it deals with the attitude. Each one must do as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. What are some of the commands that are in that one verse alone? Each one must do as he purposed. What does it mean to purpose?
Well, purpose is you've planned for it. You've made a conscious decision that I want to do this much.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it's been preceded by prayer and thought, and then I'm going to do what I made a decision to do.
Yeah. It's kind of related to the idea of intention, what my intention is.
The Old Testament time and again talks about giving thought when you make a pledge to God.
Yeah.
Think about it ahead of time, because if things turn bad and you say, well, I intended to, but that doesn't go well with God.
Yeah, I think the book of Ecclesiastes calls it the sacrifice of fools. So, yeah. So the idea of intentionality, and what does that end up teaching us about giving? We should give with some intention.
Yeah.
But that kind of means maybe planning something, making it a part of the budget, as it were. So
if you have made a commitment to do something else with the money, you're obligated to do that.
Yeah.
In other words, if I owe a man for groceries, I can't go to him and say, well, I can't pay for my groceries this week because I need to give this to God. That's not the way it should work.
It's kind of like stealing, yeah.
Now, as a landlord, I've had people come to me and I can't pay my rent this month because I spent all my money for Christmas, but that didn't go well with me either.
No. But it's a Christian holiday. Yeah, well, whatever.
That's what we lose sight of a lot of the time, because that person that would say, give those excuses and not pay the landlord, hadn't really thought about, was it 2 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8? 1 Timothy 5 and 8. A man will not provide for his own is worse than an infidel.
Yeah.
There's lots of standards that God gives us that helps us to make those decisions.
Yes.
And I find that the first intent is probably the better intent.
Right.
You know, if I say, okay, I got to participate, just like the coin cans again.
Right.
It's a small amount until you multiply it by the many thousands of people that participate, 25, 30 cents, whatever they can, and it winds up being a significant sum of money by the time it's all counted.
Exactly. So he says, give with purpose. He also says, not grudgingly or under compulsion. What is the idea of grudging about?
I think feels that you've been forced to do it, that it wasn't really your decision to do it, or I'd really rather spend this money on something else, but I don't want people to think I'm stingy.
All right, if I have to.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like grudging, or under compulsion. What's that all about? Kind of forced. You're feeling kind of forced to.
There are religions that tell you how much you must give.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, what makes for cheerful giving? I hope that none of us have ever felt grudging with regard to what we gave, or felt compelled, or I've got to give this much. What does it mean to give cheerfully?
Give from the heart.
Yeah, give from the heart.
Give it yourself.
Yeah.
It makes you feel good to do it.
Yeah, there's an old saying, give till it hurts, but the alternative to that is give till it feels good. Maybe that's the thing to do.
If it hurts to give, double it and see.
Double it and see if it feels any better.
One of Jim Piper's favorites always was.
Yeah.
You look at the checkbook, you could find out how many, or who was really concerned about the work of the church. And if you weren't concerned as you needed to be, then double it. And at some point, you will become real concerned about it.
Yeah, interesting. Well, our time is about elapsed, and so I'll go ahead and switch over to a devotional mode. But I do think it important that we have this kind of an attitude that verse 7 talks about. We're not talking about, and I'm not necessarily talking now about giving, but I am talking about giving myself as a disciple. As a disciple of Jesus, I need to know that I do have a purpose, and I am going to do what the Lord has told me that I should do. Use my gift in whatever way I need to. Even beyond all of that, I don't need to be giving in a grudging fashion or like under compulsion. But what should I be doing? Giving in a cheerful manner, living the life of a disciple in a cheerful manner. I've been talking about this, seems like a lot lately, but it just really does strike me that we do need to keep in mind that the Lord hasn't given to us all these things to do because He's trying to make us miserable. God is not some sort of a cosmic killjoy. Instead, God has given to us the commands that He's given so that we might be happy in the long haul, so that we might have heaven as our home, we might have a clear conscience, we might have all our sins forgiven. There's just so many different blessings that go along with living the life that God has told us and obeying His commandments, not because I have to, but because I want to. I've been reading through a lot of Psalms here lately, especially, and it talks about delighting in the law of the Lord. Do you delight in the law of the Lord? Perhaps this evening, if there has been some, if you know what I mean, some dirt kicking about following God's commands instead of delight, then God will call upon you to try to change the attitude. This evening, if you need to respond to God's generous call of forgiveness and help and strength, that we encourage you to come forward while we stand.
Thanks to God for my Redeemer.